St. John of Pottawatamie by Eugene Genovese. Excerpted from The Mind of the Master Class. St. John of Pottawatamie. For they have sown the wind, and they shall reap the whirlwind. It hath no stalk. The bud shall yield no meal. If so be it yield, the strangers shall swallow it up. Hosea 8:7. John Brown invoked private judgment and higher law to justify his slaughter of defenseless proslavery farmers in Kansas in 1856, while the abolitionist Charles Stearns called for the killing of proslavery settlers he described as wild beasts. When in 1859 Brown seized a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, the Baptist Reverend Thornton Stringfellow, speaking for Southern public opinion, declared Brown's bloody course the logical outcome of the abolitionists' understanding of the Golden Rule and higher law. Brown's rampage horrified most anti-slavery Northerners, who feared that, moral revulsion aside, his fanaticism and brutality discredited their cause. Hatred of slaveholders, nonetheless, mounted in the North, culminating in the glorification of Brown as a martyr after Harper's Ferry and the fable that the slave power had fabricated the massacre at Pottawatamie. Southerners themselves had mixed reactions to Harper's Ferry. A great many cried, in effect, that they knew the abolitionists would murder their wives and children, for this is what those thinly disguised infidels understood by the Golden Rule. Yet many were shocked. Perhaps they had not entirely believed their own direst warnings. Constance Cary Harrison of the slaveholding elite was among the many Virginians who devoured Uncle Tom's Cabin, and she may also have had company in thinking that Brown's raid might be God's vengeance for the torture of such as Uncle Tom. In 1859, Henry Stevens Randall of New York, biographer of Thomas Jefferson, wrote Hugh Blair Grigsby of Virginia, "The body of our people are looking on the John Brown controversy without any particular excitement, but the abolitionists are flaming hot, howling and screeching, undoubtedly anxious to dissolve the Union." A few years before Harper's Ferry, the politically moderate Frederick Grimke of Ohio, brother of South Carolina abolitionists Sarah and Angelina, testified that Northern public opinion was reining in the small minority of abolitionists. But opinions which are even tincture with sinister views ought never to be disregarded on that account. Our enemies always tell us more truth than our friends. The conservative Nathan Appleton of Massachusetts, a leading manufacturer, banker, and politician pleading for peace in 1860, told Virginians that sober Northerners who witnessed Brown's folly with silent contempt and disgust were surprised to learn that Southerners construed their silence as approval. Southerners weighed the words of Northern friends against such events as the overwhelming victory of John Andrew, an ardent supporter of Brown, in the gubernatorial election in Massachusetts. They appreciated the efforts of Northern conservatives, but an exasperated J.W. Morgan insisted in DeBow's review that Northern opinion and political power were running the other way. L.Q.C. Lamar of Mississippi, a rising political star destined for a post-war career as a senator and justice of the Supreme Court, held the Republican Party largely responsible. Northern conservatives assured Virginians that Brown's raid would prove a godsend by opening their people's eyes to the real meaning of black republicanism. But, as E.A. Pollard later remarked, the outpouring of Northern sympathy for Brown told a different story. After Harper's Ferry, Ralph Waldo Emerson declared that most Northerners admired and sympathized with Brown, and Southerners believed him. Why not? Brown embarrassed the Republicans of Illinois, and the Democrats made political hay at their expense. But the very ferocity of the Democrats encouraged Republicans to counterattack with tributes to Brown's idealism and courage. As reports of Northern reactions filtered south, protestations of revulsion at Brown's deed increasingly sounded hollow. Of 2 Iowans who fought with Brown, one hanged and the other escaped back to Iowa. When Governor Henry Wise of Virginia asked for his extradition, Governor Samuel J. Kirkwood of Iowa proceeded in the classic manner of a Spanish colonial official. Obedezco pero no cumplo. I obey but do not comply. He dawdled until the wily guerrilla escaped to parts unknown. Secular rationales for supporting Brown's foray at Harper's Ferry angered Southerners, and religious rationales outraged them. The early abolitionist espousal of Christian nonviolence gave way to acquiescence in slave revolt and sedition, indeed, any measures to effect emancipation. And now many abolitionists deified a mass murderer. With Brown's execution, church bells tolled across the North, especially in New England. Black drapes hung from stores and public buildings. Cannon fire punctuated the mourning. When Brown was hanged, a mass meeting in Cleveland, apparently with no satirical intent, lacerated Governor Wise for violating the laws of Jesus Christ as taught by Thomas Jefferson. Brown's raid horrified many in the American Peace Society, but such longtime advocates of nonviolence as Lydia Maria Child referred to Brown as an old hero and no criminal, that brave, generous old man who so willfully gives his life for God's oppressed poor, the noble old veteran. She did not know of a single person who approved of Brown's action. But I and thousands of others feel a natural impulse of sympathy for the brave and suffering man. Like Garrison, she found his foray thrilling. If the monster, slavery, had one head, assuredly I should be Charlotte Corday. Several years before Harper's Ferry, Child had reiterated her abhorrence of war, but I could be better resigned to that great calamity rather than to endure the slaveholders' tyranny that has too long trampled on us. Anti-slavery Northerners, of course, could not endorse Brown's method, but they had to admire the tenacity with which he faced the challenge of ultimate evil. In 1860, John S. C. Abbott, the anti-slavery Northern popular historian, entered the routine assertion that the North abhorred what Brown did, but he conceded widespread admiration for his courage and idealism, and announced that many Northerners were ready to replicate his feat. David Potter has remarked that if the mourning had been meant as a tribute to Brown's courage, the damage might have been contained, but unmistakably it also signified damnation of the slaveholders and assent to insurrection. With astonishing sang-froid, Brown denied any intention to raise a slave revolt. His admirers believed him, or pretended to. How did the Reverend Nathaniel Hall of Massachusetts know that Brown had no intention of raising a slave revolt? Because Brown, whose word was truth, said so. Hall attributed to Brown a heroic nobleness, a moral intrepidity, adding, apparently without appreciating the double entendre, a religious self-devotion. Yet in 1858, Lysander Spooner, abolitionist and constitutional theorist, had advocated slave revolt in the kidnapping of slaveholders, and called upon Southern non-slaveholders to join slaves to bring about emancipation. After Brown's capture, Spooner tried to organize an effort to free him. Meanwhile, every account in the European press referred to Brown's raid as a servile or Negro insurrection. Representative John Hickman of Pennsylvania threatened to replicate Brown's feat by marching 18,000 men south to whip her into submission to the higher law. Representative Thomas Hindman of Arkansas retorted that Southerners would meet them with hospitable graves. And Virginians did not take kindly to Wendell Phillips' assertion that it was Wise, not Brown, who deserved to be hanged. After Brown's execution, thousands of Northern blacks turned out to mourn him as a Christian liberator. James Newton Gloucester, a black businessman in Brooklyn, paid tribute to Brown for his actions in Kansas and linked him with Davy Crockett as an authentic American folk hero. Others, forgetting Brown's denial of intending to prompt slave revolt, boldly compared Harper's Ferry to the Nat Turner insurrection. In Pittsburgh, a mass meeting sanctified him as a hero, a patriot, and Christian, who epitomized fidelity to the Golden Rule. In Boston, the Reverend J. Sella Martin assured a crowd that he was not using the language of rage when, in the light of all Christian principle, he approved both Brown's means and ends. In 1858, Wendell Phillips had announced that no slave who failed to rebel deserved to be considered a man. The intrepid Phillips was not a man to ask of others what he did not ask of himself. When some abolitionists who had befriended Brown feared indictment and ran for cover, Phillips defiantly stood by Brown. Before long, his boldness paid off, as even weak-kneed abolitionists rallied to the new cause. William Herndon, Lincoln's law partner, was convinced that Brown would live amidst the world's gods and heroes through all the ages. Theodore Parker offered a dramatic metaphor. Virginia is a pirate ship, and John Brown sails a sea as Lord High Admiral of the Almighty, with his commission to sink every pirate he meets on God's ocean. Henry Wright taunted the Richmond Enquirer that the American sin of slavery is to be taken away not by Christ, but by John Brown. Many anti-slavery Northern ministers did condemn Brown, but others rallied to him even more extravagantly. Brown was a Christian martyr, a John the Baptist, if not the resurrected Christ. Henry Ward Beecher asked that no one pray that Brown be spared. Let Virginia make him a martyr. It was bad enough when Northern ministers echoed Victor Hugo's identification of Brown as the liberator, the champion of Christ. It became intolerable when they echoed Hugo's pronouncement, "There is something more terrible than Cain's slaying Abel. It is Washington slaying Spartacus." A bemused Basil Gildersleeve later commented, "What Washington would have done with Spartacus can readily be divined." Henry David Thoreau honored Brown as, by descent and birth, a New England farmer, a man of great common sense, deliberate and practical. It would be vain to kill this Puritan, since he died lately in the time of Cromwell, but he reappeared here. Thoreau expostulated, "You who pretend to care for Christ crucified, consider what you are about to do to him who offered himself to be the Savior of 4 millions of men." Thoreau foresaw the time when, with slavery abolished, men would be free to weep for John Brown. Then, and not until then, we will take our revenge. A year later, with Brown martyred, he summoned the Bible in words that would have seemed unseemly, even blasphemous, to most Southerners. The men who rallied to Brown adhere to the spirit and let go the letter. Emerson, blending the sacred with the secular, moved smoothly from his higher law doctrine to a ringing defense of Brown. Emerson scolded Webster for conciliating the South in his 7th of March speech in 1850, denounced the courts and denied all such laws a proper legal foundation. He defended Brown as a man with a perfect Puritan faith, who stood squarely on the Golden Rule and the Declaration of Independence. Emerson demanded to know how Governor Wise of Virginia could praise Brown as a man of integrity and courage, and then hang him. In 1860, James Redpath opened his biography of Brown by depicting one of the earth's worthiest souls, the last of the Puritans. Redpath lauded Brown for eschewing the cant of conservatism, of politics, and of non-resistance. Comparing Brown to the biblical Samson, he called Brown a warrior saint who greatly admired Cromwell as well as Nat Turner and Cinque, and who was himself in the mold of Gideon, Joshua, and Moses. Redpath appealed to the Golden Rule in the Declaration of Independence, which he, in effect, equated. At Pottawatamie, Brown had killed ruffians and executed summary justice on evildoers, acts highly beneficial to the security of the Free State men. The rest of the charges against Brown he dismissed as proslavery mendacity. In 1862, Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote in the Atlantic Monthly, "I shall not pretend to be an admirer of old John Brown, any farther than sympathy with Whittier's excellent ballad about him may go." He saw Brown as a blood-stained fanatic, observing, "Nobody was ever more justly hanged." But Hawthorne acknowledged the natural integrity of a man who won his martyrdom fairly and took it firmly. Brown won the grudging admiration of a good many Southerners as well. John Wilkes Booth acknowledged his courage and devotion to his cause, in contrast to the run of dishonest and cowardly abolitionists. The eminent Presbyterian Reverend George Howe of South Carolina remarked, "Like other men who have been notorious as robbers and pirates, he was a religious enthusiast." Howe did not disguise a sneaking admiration for a man of iron will, of great self-reliance, with the courage of a mastiff. The military offered tributes. Robert E. Lee, who captured him at Harper's Ferry, said, "I am glad we did not have to kill him, for I believe he is an honest, conscientious old man." J.T.L. Preston, on military duty at Brown's hanging, said Brown was intrepid without being braggart, a man of strong and bloody hand, of fierce passions, of iron will. Thomas Stonewall Jackson testified to Brown's dignity, military bearing, and unflinching firmness on the gallows. Jackson prayed that Brown was prepared to meet his Maker, but doubted that he was. The comparison of Brown to Jesus invited charges of blasphemy. Unappalled, George Howe lashed Emerson and the Northern clergy. He quoted J.Q.A. Griffin, a Massachusetts politician, as saying that Pontius Pilate's crucifixion of Jesus whitened into virtue when compared with Wise's treatment of John Brown. Southern preachers would not let their congregations forget that the North had transformed Brown into a martyred saint and espoused their own yearning to turn the South into another Saint Domingue. In Columbia, South Carolina, Yankee occupiers outraged Emma LeConte by telling freedmen that John Brown died for them much as Christ had died for the human race. Abolitionists deified Brown as Republicans later deified Lincoln, interpreting his assassination as atonement for America's sins, and lauding Tolstoy's depiction of a Christ in miniature. A poor black woman thought that she had lost more than her God, for God had made her a slave, whereas Lincoln had set her free. Long after the war, Southerners remembered their horror at Brown's raid and pondered its implications. John Wise, the governor's son, indirectly replied to Emerson's jibe at his father. Pity, pity, pity is it to see that splendid quality perverted and destroyed by such fatal accompaniments. It was with a genuine sigh of admiration for this fortitude that, without one doubt about their duty, the Virginians imposed the penalty for his crime upon John Brown. John Wise recorded Virginians' shock at the Northern reaction to Brown's raid, and to Northern women's dubbing Brown St. John the Just, perhaps in a cutting allusion to St. Just of the Reign of Terror. Southerners' hostility toward women preachers improved not at all when they learned that Antoinette Brown Blackwell, a Congregationalist, later Unitarian, and the first woman ordained as a minister by a leading denomination, had hailed John Brown as a hero and a martyr while reaffirming her preference for nonviolence. Senator T. M. Norwood of Georgia assailed Brown as a quintessential Puritan fanatic who perfectly represented Yankee sensibilities. W. H. Holcomb of Natchez, writing in the 1890s, still shuddered at his response as a boy to Nat Turner's slave revolt, which conditioned his shock to Brown's raid. Holcomb referred to Turner as a black John Brown. William A. Freeling rejects the fable that Brown's raid, like the Nat Turner revolt of 1831, terrified the South and plunged it toward secession. Freeling offers a necessary corrective. As he says, secessionism had been building slowly over time, and if Southerners reacted forcefully to acts of violence, they showed no signs of panic. We should not, however, carry the corrective so far as to deny that the Northern response to Brown's raid deeply affected Southern politics. Throughout the South, even most Unionists recognized secession as a right, but opposed it as injudicious. Little by little, the Unionist ranks thinned as one event or another proved the proverbial last straw for this or that individual. For many, Harper's Ferry, or its aftermath, either proved to be that last straw, or put them in a frame of mind to reject Lincoln's election more firmly than they might have done. The death of Calhoun in 1850 had created an opportunity for Unionists to swing the Democrats of South Carolina toward cooperation with the National Party, and they made substantial progress until Brown's raid strengthened the secessionists. The Northern response appalled C.G. Meminger, a veteran Southern Unionist, who saw a strong current of conservatism in the North, but was badly shaken by the subsequent elections. In Virginia, William P. J. Pegram's regiment could muster no more than 350 men before Harper's Ferry. The number doubled afterwards. In North Carolina, the Northern reaction proved a windfall for Thomas Clingman in his electoral struggle against the Unionists. In Alabama, Albert Barry Moore, future war governor, spoke softly as a Unionist Democrat until Brown's raid left him feeling betrayed. During the election campaign of 1859 in Texas, Unionist Sam Houston and John Reagan had put aside their differences to throw the radical Louis Wigfall on the defensive. Brown's raid catapulted Wigfall into the Senate. Southern students left Northern campuses to protest the response to Harper's Ferry. At the University of Mississippi, students beat and branded their black servants and carried guns on campus in defiance of the rules. The agitation over Harper's Ferry coincided with a wave of arson across the South, generally attributed to slaves. No evidence of coordination among the slaves or of an abolitionist conspiracy exists, but Southerners had difficulty in believing in coincidence. Virginians, in particular, saw a relation between Brown's raid and an ensuing wave of arson. Edmund Ruffin reported from Charleston on that wave, for which he blamed abolitionists. When a rash of fires terrified Texas and then Georgia, whites attributed them to abolitionist-inspired slave arson. In Tennessee, local mobs hanged blacks. In Rapides Parish, Louisiana, 10 or more blacks arrested on suspicion were lynched before trial. And yet, in the endless ambiguity of Southern life, whites congratulated themselves that, after all, no slave revolt had occurred anywhere, proving, or so the story went, that, despite all provocations, the slaves remained contented and loyal to their masters. For a while, Northerners had a bad time in the South, as angry mobs tarred and feathered suspected abolitionists. Businessmen, usually shielded from political uproars, returned home after deciding that this latest wave of anti-Yankeeism had turned dangerous. Catherine Cooper Hopley measured the Virginians' bitterness and took pains to let people know that she was English, not Yankee. Slaveholders voiced fears that some border state yeomen and workingmen harbored anti-slavery views and secretly sympathized with Brown. James Anderson, a planter in central North Carolina, wrote his son, who would soon marry the daughter of James Henley Thornwell, "I believe we have among us a great many who would not have been distressed if John Brown had succeeded." He recounted the words of an old local magistrate. "He will be talked of as much as General Washington 200 years hence." Anderson snorted. "He forgets that it is a successful treason that makes a hero." During the war in coastal North Carolina, a good many artisans, laborers, and small farmers spoke sympathetically of Brown. The rising voices of pro-Brown clergy in the North strengthened the secessionism of Bishops Stephen Elliott of Georgia and Leonidas Polk of Louisiana. In 1861, the New Orleans Daily Picayune published a pro-secession fast day sermon by the Methodist Reverend Joseph B. Walker, who thundered, "They have glorified as a martyr and canonized as a saint a bloodthirsty ruffian and midnight assassin, who more than any other stained his hands with unoffending Southern blood and died as a felon on the gallows." In Tennessee, Frank Carmack, of the Disciples of Christ, embodied within himself the conflicted reactions of many Unionists. On New Year's Day of 1860, he reflected on the upheavals in Europe and the rise of powerful new tyrants. As for the United States, the excitement and the events of Harper's Ferry are transferred to the Congress of the United States, and 1860 finds the jarring elements of political power in collision at Washington, threatening the dissolution of our once glorious Union. The end is not yet. 1860 may record the last hope of history of the United States, and begin to record, perhaps in letters of blood, the annals of the disseveral states of America. Columbus Morrison, a small slaveholder in Georgia, spoke for countless laymen when he invoked another version of the Golden Rule in a comment on rumors of an attempt to rescue Brown and his comrades. "It is hoped that none will escape. Philanthropy calls for their blood." Governor John Pettus of Mississippi cited Northern applause for John Brown to justify his demand for secession. For a contributor to Southern Literary Messenger in 1862, John Brown epitomized anti-Christian Northern philanthropy. "The logical manipulation of concepts in the mind," writes Marion Montgomery, "does not issue in an actual restructuring of the community of being in nature. What does result, however, is heroic self-righteousness, in which a willful alienation from existence is declared virtue rather than sin." On the eve of secession, Kezia Brevard of South Carolina made that point in her own way. She condemned that wretch, John Brown, who might have come in the spirit of Jesus and the apostles to help uplift the slaves, but instead brought the threat of war and extermination. She prayed to God to change the wicked ways of those northern cutthroats and selfish and envious sons of Satan, and to give her strength not to hate them. But she wondered, how could Southerners not hate those who wanted to exterminate them? Slaveholders would get along fine with their slaves if only those unchristian Yankees would leave them alone. But the fanatical Yankees believe they are doing God's work. They really believe that we are sinners as they are pure and undefiled. Bertram Wyatt Brown has remarked that, although John Brown is usually pictured as a Calvinist, in fact, he had a quirky religion of his own, quirky and antinomian. Only Brown actually brought insurrectionary action and antinomian ideas together as a conscious, aggressive, and dynamic part of the abolitionist movement. Mary Brown, John Brown's widow, said that religion had always been the ruling motive of his life. Southerners did not doubt her, but they found no Christianity in his religion.